My name is Claire Whitmore, and until I was 9 years old, I was convinced that my life was something permanent, indestructible, like the old maple tree outside our house in Madison, Wisconsin. Our house stood at the end of a quiet street, where in the evenings the air smelled of freshly cut grass, and neighbors waved to each other from their porches. I grew up with the feeling that the world was generally kind, and that family was something that would never let you down. My father, Daniel Whitmore, worked in real estate. He constantly talked about deals, projects, clients, but always found time for me. Sometimes he would come home late, tired, with his shirt collar unbuttoned, but he would always look into my room to wish me good night. My mother, Evelyn, worked as a school counselor. She had a way of listening that made you want to tell her even your silliest thoughts. She knew all my fears, all my dreams, and it seemed to me that she knew me better than I knew myself. We ate dinner together. Real family dinners, with conversations, laughter, sometimes arguments, but always together. On weekends, we would go out of town, have picnics, or just watch movies, huddled together on the sofa. I had no doubt. This is how all families live. This is how it will always be. I didn't notice the first cracks right away. First, my mother started staying at work more often. Then, my father started getting irritated over trifles. Their conversations became shorter, their glances colder. I didn't understand the reasons, but I felt that something was wrong. A silence settled in the house, a silence I wanted to hide from. That evening, when everything broke, I was in my room putting together a puzzle. It was an ordinary Tuesday. I heard a scream. Not a raised voice, a scream, full of rage. I went out into the hallway and stopped on the stairs. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like everyone could hear it. "Do you even understand what you've done?" My father's voice trembled with anger. "It wasn't planned." My mother sobbed. "With Robert?" "In our house," he shouted. I didn't know who Robert was. But I understood. That name was like a knife. I didn't go downstairs. I just stood there, clinging to the railing, and for the first time in my life, I felt real fear. Not for myself, but for us. After that evening, my parents hardly spoke in front of me. There were phone calls, people in strict suits, my mother's tearful eyes, and my father's stony face. I asked questions, but only received. "These are grown-up matters, Claire." A month later, my father said we were leaving. He knelt down in front of me, and I noticed how much he had aged during that time. "We'll live separately for a while. You're not to blame for anything. Never forget that." I nodded, although everything inside me was screaming. When we left, I looked out the car window until our house disappeared around the bend. I didn't cry. I just felt like a part of me had stayed there forever. Back then, I didn't know that this was only the beginning of a long journey on which I would have to grow up too soon and learn to make choices, even when every choice hurts. My father and I moved to Milwaukee in early autumn. I remember that city through the gray sky and the smell of rain that had soaked into the asphalt. Our new apartment was on the fourth floor of an old brick building. There was no elevator, and my father carried the suitcases himself every time, as if proving that he could handle it. Everything. The divorce. Me. The new life. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a living room that contained only a sofa, a television, and boxes that we didn't unpack for a long time. It lacked the coziness I was used to, but it had the most important thing, honesty. Here, no one pretended that everything was fine. My father had changed. He had always been serious, but now there was a harshness about him. He checked my homework, kept track of my time, and set rules. Sometimes I felt like he was afraid of making a mistake, afraid of losing me the way he had lost his family. I was angry, but deep down I understood. He was learning to be a single parent. I often stayed with his parents, Richard and Nancy Whitmore. Their house was in the suburbs, surrounded by neat lawns and old trees. Grandma Nancy never asked questions if she saw I was having a hard time. She would simply put a bowl of homemade soup in front of me and sit down next to me. Grandpa Richard was a man of few words, but every Saturday he would take me to the park to feed the ducks. Sometimes silence heals better than words, he would say. My father worked more and more. His business unexpectedly took off, but with the money came exhaustion. He left early and returned late. Sometimes I would fall asleep before he got home, and in the morning I would find a note in the kitchen. I'm proud of you. Have a good day, Claire. Once a month I saw my mother. These meetings were strange, as if we were playing roles. At first, we would just look at each other, not knowing where to begin. Then she would start talking too much, too fast, about work, about new acquaintances, about how everything was going well for her. She took me to cafes, bought me clothes, and allowed me to do everything my father forbade. I felt grown up, but at the same time unwanted. It was as if she was trying to buy my affection, not knowing how else to bring me back into her life. Soon, Robert Miller started appearing alongside her. That same Robert. Tall, confident, with an expensive watch and a forced smile. He was always polite, but there was a wall between us. He called me little lady and patted me on the shoulder like a colleague, not a child. My mother beamed next to him. She laughed louder than before. She looked at him the way she used to look at my father. It hurt to see how easily she had replaced her old life with a new one. One day she said, "You know, Claire, Robert has a great house. There's a room there that could be yours." I was silent. I wasn't ready to hear that. My father didn't say anything about my mother. Never anything bad. He just went about his business. On Sundays, we had a ritual, no phones day. We walked around the city, ate cheap burgers, went to museums. Sometimes he would become his old self again, laughing, joking, allowing himself to be alive. When I turned 10, my father enrolled me in piano lessons. I resisted, but soon music became my refuge. At every concert, he sat in the front row. He clapped louder than anyone else, even when I made mistakes. But at night, I still thought about my mother, about why she chose someone else, about why I had to live between two worlds. Over time, visits to my mother began to change. Robert was there more and more often. We were alone less and less. She talked about the future, about moving, about a new school, about how I was old enough to choose. I was beginning to understand. One day I would have to make a choice. And the thought of it made my stomach clench. I still believed that it was possible to be a daughter to two people. I didn't yet know that a lesson awaited me that would completely shatter this illusion. By the age of 13, I had learned to live in two houses and not feel completely at home in either. At my father's house, order, quiet, and stability. My mother was all about emotions, novelty, and the feeling of celebration, which always ended too quickly. It was as if I was constantly moving, not physically, but internally, changing masks depending on where I was. My mother officially married Robert in the spring. The wedding was in Seattle, in an expensive hotel overlooking the bay. White tablecloths, fresh flowers, music that I'd barely heard. I stood to the side and watched my mother smile, a smile she hadn't shown me in a long time. I tried to be happy for her, I really did, but inside a feeling was growing that I couldn't name at the time. Now I know it was a premonition. After the wedding, my mother started talking about me more often in the context of our new family. "Robert is trying so hard for us," she would repeat. "He wants everything to be right for us." Right became her favorite word. The right school, the right grades, the right clothes, the right behavior. I started to feel that love had become something I had to earn. Robert tried to appear caring. He asked about school, showed interest in my activities, but there was no warmth in his gaze. There was calculation. He often emphasized how much money they were spending on my visit, on gifts, on trips. It sounded like a joke, but I heard irritation in his words. My mother started talking about me moving in with them permanently. "You're not a little girl anymore, Claire," she said, stirring her coffee. "The Corps will take your opinion into account. We have more opportunities, a better school, a better future." I listened and felt something inside me resisting. But at the same time, I wanted to believe that she really wanted to be with me. I wanted to get back the mother who read me books and knew all my fears. My father knew nothing about her conversations, or pretended not to know. He became even more silent. Sometimes I caught his gaze, tired, anxious. It seemed to me that he was already ready for defeat, even before the fight began. My mother started showing up at my school without warning. She brought flowers, picked me up after classes, talked about how I would flourish in a new environment. She constantly compared me to others. "Robert's niece goes to a private school. She's already thinking about Harvard. You could achieve more if you were in the right place." These words left a bitter taste in my mouth. For the first time, I felt inadequate. At 14, I started sleeping worse. I replayed conversations in my head, considered future options, possible consequences. It seemed to me that any choice would hurt someone, and most often my father. He still made breakfast every Sunday. Awkwardly, clumsily, but with such effort, as if it were the most important thing in his life. He asked about school, listened to my stories, even when he was exhausted after work. And he never, not once, spoke badly about my mother. One evening, my mother called and said, "Robert and I are thinking of filing for a custody review." I didn't answer immediately. I just sat on the bed and stared at the wall. "You'll be better off with us," she added softly. "You understand that, don't you?" I didn't understand. Or I didn't want to understand. My 15th birthday was approaching, and instead of joy, it brought anxiety. My parents started arguing about where and with whom I would celebrate it. For the first time in a long time, they met face to face, at dinner at my father's house. The atmosphere was heavy. My mother smiled too broadly. My father was tense. Robert was silent. And then my mother said, "Claire is already an adult. Let her decide who she wants to live with." The room fell silent. I felt everyone's eyes on me. I wanted to disappear. I looked at my father. He wasn't pleading. He was just waiting. And I said, "I want to live with my mother." Those words cut through the air. I saw something break in his face. How he lowered his gaze. How he nodded, accepting the blow. At that moment, I thought I was doing the right thing. That I was choosing the future. That I would be happy. I didn't know that this choice would be the beginning of the most difficult period of my life. The move to my mother and Robert's house happened too quickly, as if someone was afraid I would change my mind. My things were packed in one weekend. My mother bustled about, talking about a new stage, a fresh start, how everything would change for the better. Robert was in control of the process, checking lists, making phone calls, and dealing with issues that had nothing to do with me. I barely looked at my father as he stood in the doorway of our Milwaukee apartment, silently watching as my life was packed away in boxes. "You can always come back," he said softly as I was already going down the stairs. I nodded, but something tightened inside me. At the time, I didn't understand that this was a moment I would remember again and again. My mother and Robert's house was in Bellevue, Washington. Large, modern, with panoramic windows and a perfectly manicured lawn. Everything in it looked expensive and impeccable, as if no one actually lived there. I was given a room on the second floor. New furniture, designer curtains, neatly arranged decorative pillows. My mother said she tried to make everything the way I like it, but I didn't recognize myself in that room. The first few weeks were like a honeymoon. Shopping, restaurants, dinners together. My mother smiled. Robert was polite. I tried to be grateful. I tried not to complain. I tried to fit in. I was transferred to a private school. The studies turned out to be more difficult than I expected. The teachers were strict, the demands were high, and my classmates were coldly polite. I felt like an outsider. My mother reacted to my difficulties not with support, but with disappointment. "It's only a B," she would say, looking at my report card. "You can do better." Comparisons became part of everyday life, with the daughter of Robert's colleague, with the children of their friends, with some ideal version of me that I didn't live up to. Robert gradually stopped hiding his irritation. He didn't raise his voice, but his remarks were precise and cold. "There are rules in this house. We are investing considerable resources in you. I hope you appreciate it." My mother was absent more and more often. Dinner with partners, a meeting, a trip. I would come home from school to an empty house, heat up food, and eat alone in my perfect room, which was increasingly beginning to resemble a hotel room. I called my father almost every evening. We talked about nothing in particular, the weather, movies, my school. He always listened. He never said, "I told you so." He never approached me. One day, my mother started making comments about my appearance. "You should take better care of yourself. Maybe change your style? You need to look confident." I looked at myself in the mirror and stopped recognizing myself. I felt like I was constantly inadequate. The turning point was the trip I had been promised. Hawaii. My mother had been talking about it for months. I lived in anticipation. It was something to hold on to. 2 weeks before the flight, Robert called me to talk. "We'll have to postpone the trip," he said, without looking me in the eyes. "Financial issues." I nodded. I smiled. And that night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling something inside me finally break. A few days later, I woke up at night thirsty and went to the kitchen. The light was on. I heard voices. "I'm tired," Robert said irritably. "This isn't what I signed up for." "Be patient," my mother replied. "Everything will be simpler after the court hearing." "She's too expensive." "But the payments are stable." I froze. "And then?" he asked. "Then we'll find a solution. A boarding school, for example." The world narrowed to these words. I stood there, breathless, and understood. I wasn't here because I was loved. I was here because it was profitable. The next morning, my mother was affectionate. Robert was polite. I was broken. The court hearing was scheduled for a week later. And for the first time in a long time, I knew what I had to do. Even if it would be painful, even if it would destroy everything completely, I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. The week leading up to the trial dragged on agonizingly slowly. The house in Bellevue felt like a stage, where everyone was playing their part. My mother was especially attentive, too attentive. She prepared breakfasts, inquired about my studies, and hugged me goodbye before school. In her eyes, I saw anxiety hidden behind the care. Robert, on the other hand, became colder. He hardly spoke to me, as if I had already fulfilled my function and was no longer needed. I barely slept. At night, I replayed that conversation in the kitchen in my head, every word, every intonation. I wanted to convince myself that I had misunderstood everything. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. It was the truth. A bitter, unpleasant truth, but the truth nonetheless. I called my father 2 days before the trial. "Dad," I said softly, "if I tell the truth, will you be able to handle it?" He was silent for a long time. "I've always managed for you, Claire." On the day of the trial, the sky was low and gray. The courthouse in Seattle seemed cold and indifferent. The courtroom smelled of paper and tension. My mother sat upright, confidently. Robert next to her looked composed and calm. My father, on the other hand, looked tired but focused. My grandparents sat next to him. When the hearing began, I felt my hands trembling. The lawyer spoke at length, dryly, operating with facts, figures, and arguments. My life was being reduced to a folder of documents. And then the judge looked at me. "Claire Whitmore," she said calmly, "you are old enough for your opinion to matter. Who do you want to live with?" The courtroom fell silent. I felt my mother's gaze on me, confident, almost triumphant. Robert nodded slightly, as if reminding me that they expected the right answer from me. My father looked at me differently, without expectations, without pressure. He simply looked. I stood up. My legs were trembling, but my voice sounded clearer than I expected. "I want to live with my father." My mother gasped. "Claire," she began, "you can't." "And I don't want to continue living with my mother," I continued, not allowing myself to stop. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. The judge raised her eyebrows. "That's a serious statement. Can you explain the reason?" I swallowed. A week before the trial, I accidentally overheard a conversation between my mother and her husband. They weren't discussing my well-being, but money, child support, tax benefits. They were talking about sending me to a boarding school after gaining full custody. My mother jumped up. "That's a lie." She misunderstood everything. Robert paled and lowered his gaze. "I know exactly what I heard," I said, feeling tears welling up, but not letting them escape. "I lived in a house where love became conditional, where I was compared, criticized, and treated as an obligation, not as a daughter." The judge looked at me intently. "Do you understand that you are speaking under oath?" "Yes," I replied, "and I'm ready to repeat it." There was a recess. Half an hour felt like an eternity. I sat next to my father, not daring to look at him. I was afraid to see pain, disappointment, or anger in his eyes. But when I finally looked up, I saw only one thing: pride. When the hearing resumed, the judge announced the decision. Considering the child's testimony and the circumstances presented, the court rules to grant primary custody to the father, Daniel Whitmore. The mother is obligated to pay child support and adhere to the established visitation schedule. The world seemed to stop. I didn't immediately understand that it was all over, that I no longer had to pretend. As we left the courtroom, my mother grabbed my arm. Her face was contorted with anger. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "You've always been ungrateful. You're just like him." Those words hurt, but they no longer controlled me. I left without looking back. That day I returned to where I was wanted not for money, but simply for myself. Returning to my father wasn't an instant relief, like in the movies. There were no fireworks, no tears of joy, or the feeling that everything immediately fell into place. There was only a quiet understanding. I was back where I didn't have to pretend. We returned to Milwaukee late that evening. The apartment greeted us with a familiar smell of coffee and old books. Everything was in its place, as if the house had been waiting for me. My father silently placed my suitcase against the wall, and then awkwardly hugged me, carefully, as if afraid to hurt me. "I'm glad you're home," he said simply. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in many months. The first few weeks were strange. We were both learning to live together again. I felt a lot of guilt for the words I had said, for the choices I had made, for the pain I had caused my father. He felt the fear of losing me again. We hardly spoke about it aloud, but it all hung between us. At my grandmother's suggestion, we started family therapy. At first, I hated those sessions. Talking out loud about what hurt turned out to be scarier than staying silent. But gradually, the words started to come out. I talked about how I felt unwanted. My father talked about how he felt abandoned. We cried. Sometimes we got angry, but we listened to each other. It changed everything. I changed schools and returned to a calmer environment. My grades improved and I slept better. I started playing the piano again, not for competitions, but for myself. Music became my refuge, a place where I could be myself. My grandparents were always there. Their house became my second home again. There, they didn't ask, "How could you?" They said, "You coped." And that's the main thing. I joined the school debate club almost by accident. The first time I stepped up to the podium, I felt my voice tremble, not from fear, but from strength. I spoke about children's rights, about how divorce can break or strengthen a person. I spoke, and they listened to me. At that moment, I understood. My voice matters. When I turned 18, my father gave me an album. Old, worn. Inside were photographs from my childhood, the ones I thought were lost. The three of us on the beach. My mother laughing. My father holding me on his shoulders. "I wanted you to know," he said, "that you had a real childhood. And it hasn't gone anywhere." I cried for a long time. But these were different tears. I didn't communicate with my mother. Sometimes I thought about her, about who she had become and who she was. I didn't hate her. Hatred requires too much energy. But I wasn't ready to forgive either. Maybe someday. But not then. Now I'm 20.
I'm studying psychology.
I want to work with children who have experienced divorce because I know what it's like to be the object of the decision. I speak at conferences, participate in support programs, and share my story, not to blame, but to remind people that children are not tools or compensation. My father comes to every one of my presentations. He always sits in the front row. Sometimes I catch his eye and see him smiling, quietly, reservedly, but with such pride that it takes my breath away. My life isn't perfect. I still have fears. I'm still learning to trust. Sometimes I feel like I have to earn love. But now I know true love doesn't require proof. I survived. I grew up. I chose myself. And that is my most important choice.